The Vikings schedule is out. There's a couple things we can learn from it, and also a whole bunch of stuff about Jaquelin Roy. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3, you like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day, each and every day. And a special shout out to my hashtag everydayers. Sound off if you can. You can find the show wherever you find your favorite podcasts, including YouTube or any audio platform, or Amazon Fire and Roku. If you have those, you can just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. Today is schedule release day, a bigger deal for some than others. I'm definitely not somebody that freaks out too much about it, although, hey, if you're waiting to make travel plans or whatever, that info is out, so go nuts. But there are a couple of things worth analyzing here. I'm not going to do like a game-by-game schedule prediction or whatever. I don't think that that's a really fruitful exercise. It's like doing a March Madness bracket. It's like this is going to get screwed up before anybody, like by 2 seconds into it. So unless you got an office pool going or something, you're making something out of it. It's not really going to be informative. But there are a couple things that we can say about the schedule that are at least interesting enough. But most of the show is going to be about Jaquelin Roy, a little bit about his story, and then another interview with Locked On LSU's Caroline Fenton. So let's get into the schedule. The Vikings will open with a home noon game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Love to open at home, love to open with a noon game and all that stuff. In fact, look, there's a lot of noon games, but there are also 5 primetime games. That's something that you might be interested to know. There's a Thursday nighter at Philadelphia. That's week 2. They also are going to play a Monday night game against the 49ers, Sunday night game at Denver, and then they've got a couple of night games against Green Bay and Chicago near the end of the season. So that should all be really fun. Couple of primetime games in a row, too. Week 11, Week 12. Those are slated to be primetime games. They start flexing them by Week 12, though. So if like the Vikings and Bears aren't good or whatever, that might get flexed out, but we'll see. What I'm usually looking for when it comes to the schedule, because we've known the opponents for a while, like the Vikings play a first place schedule. I think that's an overblown thing a little bit. Like it does affect a few games, but the Vikings share a schedule game for game with the entire division outside of 3 games in the rotation, right? The 2 teams from the division you aren't playing all of, but everybody is playing the entire NFC South, right? The Vikings play the Eagles and 49ers, where other teams will get the Seahawks and Cowboys or whatever. So there's those two games, and then the new game, the 17th game that they just expanded it to, we get the Bengals, other teams get the Ravens or Steelers or whatever. Those 3 games are the big difference. And that's 3 of 17. That's it. And that gets mitigated by the fact that we are a first place team. The Vikings are a first place team, and we do not have to play the Vikings twice. I guess, in a manner of speaking, we play against the Vikings 17 times if you think about it, but that's neither here nor there. So, the Packers or Bears, who get to play slightly weaker teams in the other divisions, also have to play the Vikings, who theoretically should be a better team. After all, they won the division, right? Or by that same logic. Now, will the Vikings be the same team they were last year? Who's to say? But you would also say that about like every team, right? Who's to say the Cowboys won't be the best team in the NFC East this year and the Vikings lucked out or something like that, right? I don't know. I wouldn't pick it, but who knows, right? So I think that whole thing is a little bit overblown, and I wouldn't freak out too much about like strength of schedule. What I'm looking for is travel, time zones and stuff. How much of a challenge is that going to be? The Vikings don't tend to have to travel a lot unless they're going internationally, which they are not this year. But because, the Minnesota is nice and central, the trip is never going to be that crazy. You look like the Seahawks have to travel the most in the league every year because they have to go so far for each away game. There's not a lot of teams around the Seattle area. Like, look at a map, right? But the two road trips the Vikings have, and when I say road trips, I mean like back-to-back road games, right? They have back-to-back road games twice. There's no threefers. It's actually pretty every other throughout the whole schedule, which is interesting. But they have one that's Green Bay and then Atlanta, so the travel there is not too bad at all. And then they have one that is Las Vegas, which I believe is Western time zone, right? And then the next game they play at Cincinnati, which is Eastern time zone. So that might be a little bit difficult, but not too shabby. And what's huge here, no cold games except Cincinnati in December. That'll probably be pretty cold. But otherwise, that you're not looking at like famous inclement weather places. You're not going to Buffalo in December. You're not going to Lambeau or Soldier Field in December. The Vikings, I think, had to do all of November, I think, was the Bills game. But they had to do all that stuff. They had to go on the road later, rain, weird weather, and stuff. It feels like the Vikings are maybe dodging that a little bit. They go to Denver in November. That'll be a little chilly, and there's always kind of the chance of rain or snow or whatever every time you go play outdoors. But getting that game in November feels pretty good. Getting the Lambeau game in the last couple days of October. Going to Soldier Field in October as well. Those games being hopefully a little bit warmer weather should be nice. So honestly, that's all I think you really need to worry about. If you're booking travel, go at it. Kind of interesting. You're going. You're rounding out the season with Lions, Packers, Lions. So you play the Lions 2 times in 3 weeks. That's interesting. But it's also interesting. Rounding out the season at Detroit Lions. Decent enough chance it's a game for the division. The Lions are favored to win it. The Bears, Packers, and Vikings, depending on what sportsbook you go to, are sort of all in a group with each other. So that game could be really, really important. Or I don't know, then somebody could fall apart. Who knows? And that's, again, why this like deep schedule analysis is something that doesn't capture me as much, because we just don't have a great idea about how good teams are. Some teams that we are sure are going to be good are going to suck. Someone's quarterback gets hurt. Someone's quarterback breaks out who wasn't supposed to. It's just always the way it goes. So we'll see. I mean, look, we know the Chiefs game will be tough, but I don't know. Maybe Patrick Mahomes isn't playing that game for some reason. Happened last time the Vikings played the Chiefs. It's not that crazy to imagine. So instead of trying to bog you down with, well, I think this one's a win and that one's a loss and this one's a win and that one's a loss, and to be the 938th person to tell you that I think the Vikings will go 11-6, I'll spare you that fakeness, that lack of authenticity, and instead we'll go to the Everyman series and continue it with Jaquelin Roy, who's next on the docket. A little bit about his story and some info from Caroline Fenton. But before I get to that, let me talk to you about the clutchest thing in my kitchen right now, which is Built Bar in my pantry. I have been trying to be a little better and trying to take my health a little bit more seriously, and that means watching what I eat a little bit more, counting calories a little bit. But look, I'm weak, and I still get chocolate cravings. So that's where Built Bar comes in. When it's late at night, like when I record, it's usually deep in the night, and I want something to kind of tide me over. Built Bar is there. It's 130 calories, so it's not screwing up my whole day, even though I'm eating it late at night. 4 grams of sugar, like 17 grams of protein. Those are good numbers for a snack that tastes like a candy bar that's covered in 100% chocolate and comes in crazy flavors like cookies and cream and cookie dough puff and churro or whatever. And you can get all that stuff at Built.com, by the way, as well as some specialty flavors that are limited edition that just kind of pop out every once in a while. But you can also go to a local Walmart or Sam's Club and still get some interesting boxes with interesting flavors in there, and you don't have to wait for shipping. But if you'd rather have it delivered straight to your door, always an option. That is at Built.com. Thank me later. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day, and another shout out to my hashtag Everydayers. I want to start this next story around Baton Rouge, Louisiana, somewhere, I'll call it 2009. I don't have a great date on this particular anecdote, but an 8-year-old Jaquelin Roy and a much older teammate of his are pushing an SUV. I couldn't find the context behind that, but I don't know, maybe a car broke down or something, and they're pushing it along the road. And his teammate, the older one, slips and falls down. Jaquelin Roy just keeps pushing. And much to the surprise of Jaquelin Roy's family, he can push the SUV. He's 8 and he can do this. And the reason his teammate is like 3 years older than him is because he's so much bigger than the rest of his classmates. He's actually playing up a grade. And he would do that for most of his childhood when he would play football. He played up a grade because he was just this huge dude. Yeah, nose tackle out of LSU. That's how a lot of these stories start. Is you go, oh my God, this dude is 8 years old and he looked like he could beat you up. But at least as his family describes him, and he might hate this, but as his family describes him, a bit of a softy, a little sensitive. They would tussle his hair and kind of treat him like that. Like you treat the youngest, and that can get frustrating. I super relate to that. It's like the youngest in like my kind of group, my age group of cousins all the time growing up. You kind of be the youngest in the room, and there is a certain authority that like everybody else in the room has over you, and you start, I get it, it's something that I can definitely relate to. But for Jaquelin Roy, it sort of drives him, the everything is very personal. Every loss is this personal thing, and imperfections in his game that hurts. He would be super irate after he'd had a bad game or after he would lose a game, and that drove him to try to iron out every inconsistency. And as you read how he handles every little challenge, it is very detail oriented. And every tiny little thing he's aware of, and it matters. And I think some of that is born of sort of being hyper aware of yourself all the time growing up. I don't know, maybe I'm just grafting too much of my own personal experience onto him, but what are you going to do? He's also very like loyal to the Louisiana area, big LSU kid, went to LSU camps as a kid and all that. So he like really quickly committed to LSU. And then he sort of had second thoughts, and he started thinking, oh, maybe I did that too fast. Maybe I should really look at other schools and really weigh my options. And so he decommits and he weighs his options. And then he's like, hey, yeah, I'll be a Tiger. And he had this like whole signing day party where he was with like this big reveal, and there's like a tiger on the couch, like a stuffed tiger. And it's like, he's an LSU dude through and through. He's going to go be an LSU Tiger. And so that's the case. He commits as part of the class of 2020, same as Jay Ward. But, it doesn't start the way he wants it to. For one, that's 2020, right? Weird year to start your college career. But also, he only plays in 9 games his freshman year. He doesn't start any of them. He only starts 1 game his sophomore year. For a 4-star recruit, he was the second most hyped up guy in that recruiting class of 2020 for Ed Orgeron's LSU Tigers. The number 1 guy was Keishawn Booty, who was a 5-star recruit, if I remember. But for Jaquelin Roy, that, I don't know, you're a 4-star recruit, maybe you expect a little bit more. Maybe the team expected a little bit more from him. I don't think that's too crazy of a thing. But, who knows what kind of expectations there are. And at any rate, headed into his 3rd year of college, which was last year, he changes positions. He was playing 3 technique for the most part. And then he moves to nose tackle, which is not a crazy position change, but it's something a little bit more of a different technique, lining up against centers instead of guards a little bit more. And you have to bulk up a little bit, which is kind of funny. Because throughout Jaquelin Roy's whole like experience, keeping weight off was kind of a goal. Where, I mean, when he was younger and he wasn't taking his diet as seriously and stuff, there was some bad weight, so he kind of had to shed that and then try to bulk up a little bit more when he got into college with some like more real muscle. By the time he comes out, he's 315. That's a great weight. But he's like tasked with bulking up and sort of retooling his technique. But to hear him talk about it, it's like an opportunity to sort of reset some of the things he didn't like with his footwork and Something different he does with his hand and all this really cool technique stuff that I kind of wish I knew more about defensive line technique. That's one that I would see as a weakness for me right now. Um, but for Jaquelin Roy, that attention to detail is so apparent every time you see a quote or hear him talk that you can kind of see why that worked out. That nose tackle, which is a very detail, like technique and detail is really important at nose tackle. Like at a certain point, you're just kind of trying to hold a spot, and how big of a dude are you, right? But tell that to an actual defensive tackle, and they'll look at you like your head screwed on backwards because there's so many little nuances and details that have to come with the way you set up and your first steps and the way you attack and where you put your hands and all that stuff. And I think that part of it is where Jaquelin Roy really found his game. There is, I guess, something to the idea of reinventing yourself where, okay, this isn't working. I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with that. I could probably fix it. But now here is an opportunity to be a totally new and better version of me. Um, and I think that that's really cool. And that is what gets Jaquelin Roy ultimately a good enough final season to get drafted in the fifth round by the Minnesota Vikings. For more on Jaquelin Roy, though, and a much closer perspective than what I can know, researching after the fact, let us turn it over to Caroline Fenton of Locked On LSU. Keeping it going here with Locked On Vikings, chatting with Caroline Fenton of Locked On LSU. You can go check her out wherever you listen to this show. Uh, let's talk about Jaquelin Roy. This is, I think, a pick that a lot of people were a lot more excited about. I think he fell further than people thought, so people are really stoked on the value. But I honestly I don't know a lot about him. I just know that he's like a big defensive tackle, which
Mhm.
describes most defensive tackles. So, what's the broad strokes?
Yeah, they're all big, aren't they?
Yeah.
Jaquelin Roy, he is one of those anomalies that I look at. When you look at a guy, a defensive tackle, even an offensive lineman, and you're like, you are a massive human being. How in the world can you move like that? Like he's almost like a 300-pound ballerina. He is so athletic. He can move around so quickly and with so much ease. And I always look at, you want speed on your team. And that doesn't come with just speed in your feet. That doesn't come with just being a 4.40. That's guys that know exactly what their assignment is and can do it right off of the line of scrimmage. And that's exactly what Jaquelin Roy can do. Even if he's not the biggest guy out there, even if he's not the most well named out there, he'll be able to beat you because he's just gonna get there quicker. And he's been a not a staple of this LSU defensive line for the longest period of time. 2022 was really the only season that he was a consistent starter. He'd seen a good bit of work the entirety of his career. He played in several games as a true freshman, but wasn't a consistent starter until 2022. So I think that's one thing that you have to keep in mind with Jaquelin Roy is there's going to be some refining that needs to be done that you would expect
Gotcha.
with a late round pick or a UDFA. So he's gonna have a little bit of work to do to get acclimated to the next level. But I think he's just the kind of guy that all of the tools are there, just needs a little bit more experience since he's only been a starter and has 1 year of consistent starting.
That makes sense. And I think I want to circle back to that. But first, I just want to ask, where did he line up? Was he like a zero tech, or did he go out to the tackles a little more?
Interior, really on the interior. And, you kind of cross over a couple different defensive schemes with Ed Orgeron and with Brian Kelly, but he's an
Hmm.
interior guy. He's not going to be, you're not going to see him on the outside very much. He's not going to be an edge rusher. You're not going to see him consistently out on the outside as a tackle.
Gotcha. So
Yeah.
when you talk about refinement, can you get more specific in terms of like what are the things that you think at least he could stand to learn to like succeed at the NFL level?
Yeah, I would say it's just getting more reps going up against really big offensive linemen and going up against offensive linemen that
Okay.
are some of the top and the best in the league. Because I think sometimes we saw Jaquelin Roy would struggle a little bit since he can play so many snaps. Like I said, he is so agile, he is so athletic. He can be out there and play several snaps. But I think it's just
Mhm.
going to take him a little bit of time to get up to the speed of the game, being so used to playing so many snaps and being able to stay out there for so long for a good chunk of the game. I think it's going to take Jaquelin Roy a little bit of time to say, okay, wait, now I can't do this. I can't perform at the same level or with the same longevity that I did at the college level just because my assignments and what I'm going to be asked to be doing and the offensive linemen that I'm going up against are just that much more difficult.
Right, and maybe you can kinda say, "Look, we love your stamina, but we maybe wanna give you these kinda tools that make you better at beating these guys, and it's okay for" I mean, defensive tackles rotate in and out all the time. Those are big dudes to be running around.
Right, exactly, and I think Jaquelin Roy also, that defensive line as a whole, as a unit, it was a group that knew each other very well. It was a group that they were veterans, even given, lack of starting experience for Jaquelin Roy. He had still been in that locker room for a long time and had a lot of in-game experience. So I think that Jaquelin Roy and, the guys on his right and left and Ali Gay and BJ Ojolari, they were cornerstones of that defensive line, that
Mhm.
LSU defensive line. They were leaders, they were veterans, and they were also pretty darn good players. So I think that might be a little bit of a learning curve for him as well, just getting acclimated to a different defensive line and different teammates and just kind of learning a new system.
And then, last thing, I'll kinda wrap this out the same way. What's something about Jaquelin Roy that I'm not gonna be able to learn just by watching him play that I should know about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I struggle with that a little bit more. I would say, same thing with Jaquelin Roy. The kind of guy that you want in your locker room. He loves football. He's not going to be the kind of guy that gets in a bunch of trouble. I would say that Jay Ward was probably a little bit more of an obvious leader, at least me looking from the outside, looking in. I would say Jaquelin Roy is one of those people, at least from my interpretation, and this is more of an off the field thing that I do think translates into the locker room and onto the field. He's incredibly loyal. Jaquelin Roy is from Baton Rouge. He went to a high school that's actually on LSU's campus. Jaquelin Roy could have gone to virtually any school in the country, and he decided to stay at LSU. That's something that LSU covets a whole lot with a lot of in-state players, is keeping the top talent in state. Jaquelin Roy could have left LSU whenever LSU was going through a transformational period from Ed Orgeron to a year, the first non-winning season in several years in LSU history. You're going through a coaching turnover, and then you bring in a new coach and Brian Kelly, and it's a completely new culture. It's complete new expectations. Joquelin Roy could have transferred and really probably could have gone anywhere in the country that he wanted to go to. And he decided to stick with LSU, as did several of these veteran players decided to stay at LSU. But I think that with Joquelin Roy, that was something that, was really emphasized with him, considering he is a hometown kid, considering he did have so many options, and considering that he did want to stay at LSU. I would say that's something that does stand out to me, is the loyalty of Jaquelin Roy and just the love and adoration to be a good football player.
It's gonna be really interesting in the college ranks, I think, the next few years as we learn just how much the NIL deals can be, like, how many players are gonna really, like, actually go for I mean, that's what Jordan I just, got finished talking to someone about Jordan Addison, who
Yeah,
did
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it was all money, he just did that, I mean, he was a Pitt guy, it was his whole deal,
Mhm.
but you're not gonna turn that down, you know? Especially you can get
And
hurt at any time, that'll screw your draft stock, like, who knows?
And I do look at, like, this quarterback class, for example. Would Bo Nix have left Oregon if not for NIL? Would Sam Hartman have just gone to the
Mhm,
league and not have transferred to Notre Dame if it weren't for money? I mean, I have no
mhm.
idea, but I have a pretty good idea that if you're looking at it saying, "Hey, I'll be a 6 or 7 round draft pick. I can make X amount of dollars. I can do that and stay where I am and have a lot more fun doing it and maybe improve my draft stock for next season." So it is kind of interesting to see the changes in the cycles now that there's money attached to it. Crazy how that works, isn't
E
it?
exactly. A day 3 pick, your NL money's probably blowing out what the NFL is gonna do for you, so I wonder if kids are gonna start coming out a little bit older as well, but I guess we just have to, wait and see. Caroline, thank you so much for giving me your
Yeah.
time and chatting about these LSU defense players. Super interesting
Yeah,
guys.
yeah,
Staying in purple and gold.
absolutely. Take care of him for me, as good as you've taken care of Justin Jefferson.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll have gritties are everywhere now. Everybody on the Vikings does a great thing now.
Who doesn't gritty now? I mean, it's
Yeah,
global. It's going
it's global.
global.
It is global. All right, Caroline, let people know where to find you if they want to listen to stuff about LSU more.
Yeah, you can find me at Locked On LSU wherever you listen to podcasts. We are also on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter at Caroline Fenton One.
Thanks again for Caroline, who broke down a couple players for us here. We did Jay Ward earlier in the week as well. Again, you can check her out at Locked On LSU. Wherever you're listening to this show, you can find that show as well. I will see you all next week. And as always, Skull.